I sealed the world out with 42 turns of a forged steel wheel. The sound was not a clang, but a deep, resonating chunk as 9 titanium bolts, each as thick as my wrist, slid home into the reinforced concrete frame of the inner airlock door. A final hiss of equalizing pressure, and then silence. Not quiet. Silence. A total, absolute absence of sound from the world above. My name is Thorn, and as of that moment, I was the only human being in a self-contained universe approximately 3,000 cubic feet in volume. The year-long project I called Project Cicada, a survival shelter buried 95 feet beneath an abandoned water treatment facility on land I'd inherited, was now active. Its primary directive: to keep the outside world, specifically the infected, out. Its secondary unspoken directive: to keep me, Eris, sane. I was about to discover which was the harder task. The outbreak, dubbed the trembling sickness for the violent neurological seizures in its early stages, hadn't been a surprise to me. As a civil engineer with a paranoid streak and no family, I'd seen the cascading failures in global supply chains, the bizarre news reports from isolated towns. I didn't board up windows. I didn't join the frantic exodus. I simply drove to my remote property, descended the camouflage access shaft disguised as a septic maintenance hole, and initiated lockdown. The surface access shaft was now filled with a rapid-set polymer concrete, indistinguishable from the surrounding bedrock. The only remaining links to the surface were 3 heavily baffled, micron-filtered air vents and a geothermal heat exchange pipe. I was not buried alive. I was insulated. The shelter was a masterpiece of austere efficiency, a 3-chambered, self-replicating womb. Chamber 1, the Nexus, my living space, a 15 by 15 square containing a cot, a fold-down desk, a digital library, and the master control panel blinking with green status lights. Chamber 2, life support, a humming, blinking closet of machinery, air scrubbers recycling my carbon dioxide, water purifiers cycling condensation from the air, and a tapped aquifer, the geothermal unit providing steady 68-degree ambient temperature. Chamber 3, the vault, shelves of freeze-dried meals calculated for 5 years, seed banks, a genetic library of food stock embryos in cryo-storage, tools, and medical supplies. It was a mausoleum of everything I might need to rebuild a world I no longer believed would exist. The first week was a honeymoon of functionality. I ran diagnostics, calibrated systems, organized my digital files. I exercised in confined space, my breathing the loudest sound. I watched the external camera feeds on a monitor, grainy, gray views of the overgrown facility above, now patrolled by shambling figures with the characteristic jerky gait of the late-stage infected. They posed no threat. They couldn't reach me. I had solved the equation of survival. I was safe. But safety, I learned, is a vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. The silence began to morph. It wasn't an absence of noise. It was a presence. A low, almost subauditory hum from machinery became the baseline of my existence. My own heartbeat, my swallowing, the rustle of my clothes. These were seismic events. I started talking to the status lights. Air quality optimal, Eris. Thank you, Eris, I'd say in a flat voice. The absurdity didn't strike me. It felt like protocol. The first true test came on day 17. A minor alarm trilled. Pressure differential in air vent 2. A blockage. On the camera feed, I saw the cause. A raccoon, or what was left of one, had become lodged in the external baffling, likely chased by an infected. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was a physical breach. However minor, the protocol was clear. Initiate a purge cycle, using a blast of compressed air from inside to clear the obstruction. But the purge cycle was loud. Would it draw attention? Was there even consciousness left to pay attention? I spent 4 hours watching the vent camera, watching the infected shuffle past, oblivious to the dead animal. Finally, the engineer in me overruled the hermit. I initiated the purge. A deep whoosh echoed up the vent pipe, a sound I felt in my teeth. On screen, the raccoon carcass blew clear. The infected nearby didn't react. They didn't hear it. The sound, muffled by 95 feet of earth and concrete, was mine alone. The crisis was averted, but the psychological seal had been breached. The outside could reach in, even if just with a dead raccoon. My bell jar had a flaw. That night, lying in the cot, I felt the weight, not of the earth above, but of the time ahead. 5 years of rations. 5 years of this humming silence. 5 years of talking to lights. I had built a perfect shelter to preserve a life. But what exactly was I preserving? The memory of a man who liked coffee and crosswords? That man was already fading, replaced by Eris, the operator system cicada. I got up and went to the digital library. I scrolled past engineering manuals, survival guides, vast literary classics. I stopped at a file simply titled Personal. Inside were photos. Me with college friends, now certainly dead or worse. A birthday party. A sunset from a hiking trip. The colors seemed impossibly vibrant. The smiles grotesquely wide. They were artifacts from a fossil layer. I closed the file. The silence in the nexus felt heavier, richer, like a fog I could swim through. I had cut off surface access. But as I sat in the sterile glow of the master console, surrounded by the hum of my own creation, I understood the terrifying trade. I had guaranteed my biological survival by severing the very connections that made survival meaningful. I was not in a shelter. I was in the world's most sophisticated coffin, and I was both the occupant and the mortician. The struggle wasn't against the infected. It was against the silence they had left behind, a silence I had willingly sealed myself into, and I was just beginning to listen to what it had to say. Time without a sun becomes a theoretical concept, then a torment. I had synchronized my shelter's master clock to the atomic time signal right before the blackout. It displayed in crisp green digits. Day 043. 14 hours, 32 minutes, and 17 seconds. Every second was accounted for, a tiny digital tombstone. I began to hate the clock. It's relentless. Forward march was a lie. Down here, there was no forward, only duration. My days developed a rigid monastic structure, a scaffold against the creeping formlessness of eternity. 0600, wake. The alarm was a soft, escalating chime I'd come to loathe. 0615 to 0700, calisthenics. Push-ups, squats, stretches in confined space of the nexus. The sound of my own grunting breaths was obscenely loud. 0700 to 0730, hygiene cycle. For minutes of recycled water in the ultrasonic shower. Brushing teeth with minimal water. 0730 to 0800, breakfast. 1 packet of nutrient-optimized gruel, rehydrated. Taste was irrelevant. Caloric and nutritional input was key. 0800 to 1200, system maintenance and study. Checking every readout on life support. Running diagnostics. Then 4 hours of structured learning from the digital library. I was relearning advanced calculus, studying Mandarin, dissecting the engineering principles of Roman aqueducts. My mind was a sponge in a desert, soaking up anything to stay occupied. 1200 to 1230, lunch. Another packet. Sometimes a treat, a piece of hardtack. 1230 to 1700, project time. This was the most important block. I had to create, not just consume. I started by mapping the shelter in obsessive 3D rendered detail. Then I began a virtual model of a theoretical, expanded shelter. I wrote code for more efficient life support algorithms. I terraformed Mars in the simulation. 1700 to 1730, dinner. 1730 to 2000, leisure. I tried reading fiction, but the stories of human interaction felt like cruel fantasies. I listened to music, but the swell of an orchestra in confined space was overwhelming, emotionally violent. I settled on nature documentaries, muted, watching time-lapse of plants growing, galaxies spinning. Silent, beautiful processes that didn't require people. 2000 to 2200, personal log. I recorded a verbal diary, my voice flat and clinical. Day 58. All systems nominal. Completed analysis of geothermal pump efficiency. Increased calcium intake by 2% due to potential leaching from recycled water. No external activity beyond baseline, infected patrol patterns. 2200, lights out. I would lie in the absolute dark, listening to the hum and the clock's soft digital heartbeat, willing sleep to come. This schedule was my Bible. To deviate was to invite the void. On day 61, I overslept by 23 minutes. Waking to see 6:23 on the clock sent a jolt of pure panic through me. My entire day was skewed. The scaffolding wobbled. I rushed through my exercises, my heart pounding with irrational anxiety. I skipped the detailed study, just glazed over the system readings. By project time, I was adrift. I opened the Mars simulation, but just stared at the red polygon landscape, feeling nothing. The silence, usually kept at bay by ritual, rushed in. It had a texture now, thick, velvety, pressing against my eardrums. I started hearing things. Not voices, but patterns in the hum. A rhythmic pulsing that wasn't on any diagnostic. A faint, high-pitched whine from the air circulator that seemed to form words. Ariasis. I'd snap my head toward the sound, and it would stop, leaving only the baseline hum. I knew it was auditory pareidolia, my brain desperately seeking signal in noise. Knowing didn't stop the chill. My body began to rebel against the perfection. Despite supplements and exercise, a low-grade ache settled into my bones. A calcium deficiency, perhaps. My sleep cycles fractured. I'd wake at 0300, convinced I'd heard a scraping at the outer door impossible, and be unable to sleep again. I started having vivid, nonsensical dreams of being on the surface, but the sky was the ceiling of the Nexus, and the trees were bundles of wiring. The only thing that kept the true madness at bay was the external camera feed. It was my window, my touchstone to reality. The infected were my clock hands. I named the regulars. Limp, had a shattered leg that dragged. Sweetie wore the tattered remains of a business suit. Marathoner paced a frantic, never completed loop. Their endless, pointless patrols were a perverse comfort. They were still there. The world was still there. I wasn't alone in the universe. I was just in a separate, cleaner jar. On day 89, the camera feed showed something new. A bird, a common crow, pecking at something near one of the vent outlets. A living, healthy, uninfected creature. I watched it, mesmerized, for an hour. Its simple animal purpose, to eat, was a profound revelation. It was free. It could fly away. I couldn't look away. When it finally flapped off, a sadness so deep it was physical washed over me. I had never been a sentimental man, but in that moment, I would have traded a year of my rations to feel the sun on my face or the wind that lifted that crow. I turned from the screen and looked at my schedule, glowing on a tablet. 14 to 1500 hours. Review hydroponic subroutine algorithms. The tyranny of the clock was complete. It dictated my movements, my studies, my meals, but it could not dictate meaning. It could not simulate a reason to look forward to the next digital sunrise. I was a ghost in a machine, perfectly preserved, meticulously scheduled, and utterly, utterly lost. The struggle was no longer about air or water. It was about the slow, certain erosion of the self, grain by digital grain, under the weight of a time that no longer meant anything at all. Sanity, I decided, was a resource like any other. It needed to be managed, measured, and replenished. My rigid schedule had prevented a catastrophic collapse, but it was a dam holding back a vast, stagnant sea of nothingness. I needed to introduce a variable, a controlled stimulus. So, on day 114, I initiated experiment theta. I would simulate a surface mission. The plan was elaborate, a testament to both my engineering mind and my deteriorating grip. Using virtual reality parameters from my digital library and the shelter's sound system, I would create a 20-minute immersive experience. I suited up in my rarely used decontamination coveralls. I stood before the inner airlock door, the one that led only to solid concrete. Over the speakers, I played a loop of wind noise, distant infected moans, synthesized from my audio logs, and the sound of crunching gravel. On the main view screen, I displayed a 360-degree render of the overgrown treatment facility from my camera's perspective, but now interactive. Using a controller, I could walk through it, Experiment Theta Initiation. I set into my personal log. My voice sounded shaky. Simulating egress for component inspection of Event Array Alpha. I placed my hand on the cold steel of the door wheel. In my headphones, the wind howled. I turned the wheel. Of course, it didn't move. The bolts were permanently engaged. But in the simulation, the door hissed open. A blast of outside air, ozone symphony air purifier, piped in, hit my face. My heart rate spiked. It was absurd. It was genius. It was terrifyingly real to my starved senses. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. I looked around the rendered weeds, the broken windows. A moan echoed to my left. I turned, my breath quickening. This was madness, productive madness. I approached the vent array. In the simulation, I saw the raccoon's remains from weeks prior. I used a virtual tool to clear it. The task complete, I returned to the hatch, sealed it, and initiated a decontamination spray, a fine mist of water from the shower nozzle. When it ended, I slumped against the real door, sweating, coveralls sticking to me. The silence of the Nexus rushed back in, but it felt different. For 20 minutes, I had done something. I had faced the outside, even a facsimile of it. The psychological relief was profound. Experiment Theta was a success. I began conducting it weekly, varying the mission, checking a fictional perimeter fence, scavenging a nearby shed for virtual supplies. It became the highlight of my existence, a drug I craved. The line between simulation and memory began to blur. Sometimes, during my routine, I'd catch myself thinking I needed to go outside to check on something. The real world, however, was not a simulation. On day 147, a new alarm sounded, a sharp, pulse tone I'd never heard. Water reclamation efficiency, 12% decline. My stomach dropped. The water system was a closed loop. My urine and sweat were purified, condensed atmospheric moisture was captured, and a small, steady trickle came from the tapped aquifer. A 12% decline wasn't critical yet, but it was a trend, a flaw. I spent 2 days in life support, running diagnostics. The filters were clean. The condenser coils were functioning. The aquifer feed was steady. The problem had to be in the reclamation processes themselves. A bacterial biofilm buildup or a slow chemical degradation no simulation had predicted. The manual called for a chemical flush using a specific solvent. I had the solvent, but the flush procedure required accessing a secondary containment vessel, which was behind a maintenance panel in the vault, bolted shut with tamper-proof screws. I had the tools, but opening it meant acknowledging the system was fallible. It meant my perfect, closed world had a slow leak. The engineer in me was fascinated. The hermit was terrified. I opened the panel. The interior was a complex maze of pipes and sensors. Following the schematic, I identified the injection port for the cleansing solvent. As I attached the hand pump, my flashlight beam caught something else. Scratches. Tiny, hairline scratches on the inner casing of a primary pipe. Not tool marks. They looked like claw marks. Impossible. Nothing was in here. Nothing could get in. I pushed the thought aside, a trick of the light and my isolation. I performed the flush. The alarm cleared. Efficiency climbed back to 98%. Crisis averted. But the scratches haunted me. I began a new, unplanned ritual. The full system diagnostic. Every night after lights out, with only a small pen light, I would open every access panel I could, inspecting, touching, listening. I was looking for flaw, the crack, the evidence that my world was not impervious. I found nothing, but the looking became compulsive. One night, during my inspection of the air circulator in the Nexus, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap from deep within the ductwork. Not the hum, a deliberate sound. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I held my breath. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, tap. It was a code. It had to be. Something was in the ducts. Something intelligent. An infected? No, they were mindless. Another survivor? How? My air vents were only inches wide, baffled and filtered. It was impossible. Hello? I whispered, my voice a dry croak against the metal grill. The tapping stopped. The only sound was the hum. I waited for an hour. Nothing. I spent the next 3 days in a state of high alert, barely sleeping, jumping at every normal sound. I set up a microphone at the air vent, recording. I heard nothing but the steady flow of air. Had I imagined it? Was it a stress-induced auditory hallucination, a sibling to the phantom whines? On the 4th day, the tapping returned. This time it was clearer, coming from the water pipes near the shower. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same pattern. It was Morse code. My heart hammered. I hadn't thought about Morse code since boyhood. I fumbled for a pen, trying to translate. Tap, tap, tap. S. Pause. Tap. E. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. S. SCS, SCS? It wasn't a word. Maybe I was wrong. Then it came again, slower. S. E. C. SEC section? Second? Secret? Tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. Tap. RED. Secret? No. SEC read. Section read? Security read? A cold, logical part of my brain cut through the panic. This was impossible. There was no physical way for a conscious entity to be in the pipes. Therefore, the signal was not external. It was internal. It was me. My own mind, fractured by isolation, was communicating with itself through the only medium it had, the infrastructure of my prison. I was tapping on the pipes in my sleep or in a fugue state and hearing it while awake. The flaw was not in the system. The flaw was in the operator. Experiment data hadn't simulated the outside. It had blurred the boundary between reality and delusion. And now, the delusion was using the pipes to talk to me. I had built a perfect shelter, but I had forgotten to fortify the most critical system, my own mind. And it was now silently tapping out its distress code against the walls of my perfect, silent world. The realization that the tapping was a product of my own mind was more terrifying than if it had been an actual intruder. An intruder could be fought, outsmarted, sealed out. How do you seal out a part of yourself? I stopped the nightly inspections. I forced myself to adhere to the schedule with robotic precision, trying to outrun the fracturing within. But the tapping became a third occupant in the shelter, unpredictable and pervasive. It would come from the water pipes during a shower, making me jump and scald myself. It would echo softly from the air vent as I ate, ruining my appetite. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. Tap. RED. Always SEC read. I began to document it obsessively, not in my personal log, but in a separate encrypted file. Time, duration, location, pattern. I was trying to find a logic to the madness, to prove it was external by demonstrating a pattern that couldn't be random. The data was inconclusive. The taps were irregular, but the repeated SEC read sequence appeared 13 times in 2 weeks. My focus shifted from maintaining the shelter to deciphering the message. SEC read. Security read? Was it a warning about the shelter security? I ran full diagnostics daily. All green. Was it a corrupted memory? Before the fall, I'd worked on a government project with color-coded security levels. Red was top-tier, compartmentalized. Had I buried knowledge so deep, even I couldn't access it consciously, and now it was leaking out? I started experimenting. The next time the taps came, I responded. I took a wrench and tapped on the pipe near the shower. Tap, tap, tap. S. Who are you? Silence. Then, a minute later, from the air vent across the room, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. ESS. S? Or was it SCS backwards? This was useless. I was a man alone in a hole, talking to the plumbing. The psychological toll was physical. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. Dark circles hung under my eyes. I started talking to the taps aloud. What do you want? Show yourself. My voice would echo in the chamber, answered only by the hum. The ghosts in the pipes had become my primary relationship, a toxic, one-sided dialogue with my own unraveling sanity. Salvation came from an unexpected direction, the external camera feed. While monitoring the usual shambling patrols, I noticed an anomaly. Marathoner, the infected who paced a frantic loop, was down. It wasn't moving. Over the next 48 hours, I watched as it truly, finally, died. Not from violence, but from what seemed like sheer decay. Its movements grew slower, more jerky, until it collapsed in a heap and did not rise. The other infected walked past it, ignoring it. It just rotted. It was the first natural death I'd witnessed in this new world. A profound shift. They weren't immortal. They were decaying organisms, running on a corrupted script. Their time was finite. This observation sparked a new, desperate project. I diverted from my schedule entirely. I began analyzing all my archived camera footage, looking for patterns of decay, movement, anything that could be data. I created a spreadsheet, tracking the visible degradation of Sweetie, Limp, and the others. I calculated estimated caloric burn rates for their shuffling gait, theorizing about their ultimate energy source. This was real. This was empirical. This was a problem my engineering mind could solve, a mystery that wasn't born of my own psychosis. For 2 weeks, I lived in the data. The tapping continued, but it became background noise, an irritating symptom I was too busy to dwell on. I was a scientist again, not a hermit. I discovered that the infected were drawn to areas of higher moisture. They congregated near a leaking old pipe on the surface. I hypothesized they were seeking water, a vestigial drive. I noted they avoided direct, prolonged sunlight, sticking to shadows. Heat regulation issues? Photophobia? This was my new experiment theta. It was real, it was external, and it gave me a terrifying, exhilarating purpose. To understand the enemy from my sterile, removed vantage point. I was no longer just surviving the apocalypse. I was studying it. The breakthrough and the crash came on day 201. I was reviewing thermal imaging data. The cameras had multispectral capabilities. When I saw it, a heat signature that wasn't infected, smaller, faster, a fox. It darted across the edge of the screen, snatched a piece of carrion near the downed marathoner, and vanished. Life, warm-blooded, healthy, thriving life. The sight filled me with joy so sharp it was pain. Then, the implication hit me. The fox was eating the infected carcass. Was the meat safe? Was the trembling sickness not transmissible to canids? Or was it bioengineered, species-specific? My mind raced with questions. I needed a sample. I needed to know. It was an impossible craving. I couldn't go get a sample. The desire to interact, to test, to reach out and touch the world, even through a hazard suit in a sample jar, was overwhelming. The shelter, my perfect sanctuary, felt like a glass cage. I could see the world, study it, but I could not touch it. I was a ghost to them, and they were becoming ghosts to me, pixelated phenomena on a screen. I slammed my fist on the console. The sharp pain was a relief, a real sensation. The ghost in the pipes chose that moment to speak again. A rapid, frantic burst of tapping from the life support chamber. Tap, 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 tap. I didn't try to decode it. I shouted, my voice raw and cracking, "Shut up! I know it's you. It's me. Just shut up." The tapping stopped, as if startled. The hum reasserted itself. I sat there, breathing heavily, the sting in my knuckles fading. I had confronted the ghost. I had named it. It was me, the part of me that was screaming in the silence, tapping on the walls of my own skull. SEC read, wasn't security warning. It was a status report. Security breach. Mental integrity. Compromised. Condition. Red. I had found a new purpose in observation, but the cost of my isolation was now a visible, audible entity sharing my tomb. I had traded the tyranny of the clock for the tyranny of a mystery, and then found a new prison within that pursuit. The prison of the observer, forever separated from the observed. The ghost wasn't in the pipes. The ghost was a man staring at the screen, longing for a world he had sealed away forever, and he was getting louder. The confrontation with the ghost, with myself, left a strange, hollow peace in its wake. The tapping didn't stop, but it lost its power. It became a symptom, like a persistent cough, to be acknowledged and ignored. My focus solidified around the external study. I named it Project Ether, To study the world above from my subterranean lab. It gave the endless days of thesis. My data on the infected grew. I confirmed their aversion to sustained sunlight. I logged their gradual decay rates. Sweetie finally succumbed on day 228, collapsing into a moldering heap near the main gate. The population density on my screen slowly thinned. Was the outbreak burning itself out? Was the human biomass simply exhausting itself? This question became my obsession. I needed a wider dataset. I had one resource I'd never utilized, the shelter's communication array. It was designed for long-wave, low-probability of intercept broadcasts and reception, meant for a world where other bunkers might exist. I had never turned it on, fearing it was a beacon. But now, the risk seemed worth the potential data. I wasn't hoping for contact. I was hoping for noise. On day 240, I powered up the array. A low, resonant hum joined the symphony of machinery. I began a systematic scan, cycling through every protected military, civilian, and emergency band. Static, eternal hissing static. The silence on the airwaves was deeper, more absolute than the silence in my shelter. It was the sound of a dead civilization. My hands grew cold on the controls. I hadn't realized how much a part of me still hoped for a whisper, a Morse code SOS, a garbled broadcast. Then, on a frequency once used for maritime weather, I found it. Not a voice, a beacon, an automated, looping signal, a digital identifier, repeating every 10 seconds. It was weak, fading in and out, but it was structured, intelligent. My heart leapt into my throat. I worked for hours to clean the signal, isolate it. It wasn't a message. It was a station ID, like from an automated weather buoy or a research outpost with failing power supply. The coordinates, when I decoded them, placed it roughly 200 miles to the northwest in a mountainous region. It was nothing, and it was everything. Proof that not all systems had gone silent. Something man-made was still ticking out there, mindlessly broadcasting its existence into the void. It was a peer, a companion in automated survival. I named it Lighthouse. Lighthouse became my new fixation. I tracked its signal strength, which fluctuated with atmospheric conditions. I theorized about its power source, solar, probably with a failing battery. I calculated its probable time to failure, months, maybe a year. Its existence changed my own. I was not the last flicker of the old world. I was one of two, a binary star system, alone in the dark. This discovery coincided with a more mundane, but critical, crisis. On day 255, the main nutrient pay dispenser in the vault jammed. It was a simple mechanical fault, a hardened clump of paste blocking a feed screw. But to fix it, I had to open the primary storage hopper, a large, pressurized unit. The manual warned of aerosolized particulate release during servicing. In a closed environment, dust was the enemy. It could clog filters, irritate lungs, carry contaminants. I suited up in full decontamination gear, sealing the nexus from life support with a plastic curtain. As I unbolted the hopper lid, my hands trembled. This was the most invasive repair I'd attempted. With a hiss, the seal broke. A fine, off-white powder, the dust of my primary food source, puffed into the air. My suit's filters handled it, but I could see it hanging in the LED light, a miniature galaxy of my own sustenance. The repair was simple. The cleanup took 6 hours. I vacuumed, wiped, and filtered the air in the sealed-off section 3 times. But dust, I learned, is insidious. For days, I found fine powder in the seams of my console, on the pages of my few physical books, a faint coating on my drinking cup. It was everywhere, a reminder of entropy. No system is truly closed. Everything wears down. Everything becomes dust. The equation of my survival was now clear. I had calculated for 5 years of food, water, air. But I hadn't fully calculated for the slow, grinding failure of 1,000 small parts, the seals that would dry rot, the plastics that would become brittle, the metals that would fatigue. And I had calculated nothing for the decay of the mind, a system far more complex and fragile than any air scrubber. Lighthouse's signal was a countdown clock. My own systems were a mosaic of tiny, ticking clocks. The infected outside were decaying clocks. We were all in a race against dust. A new, grim ritual emerged. Inventory and degradation assessment. I began cataloging every single component in the shelter, estimating its operational lifespan, noting any signs of wear. The list was massive, daunting. A capacitor on the geothermal control board showed a slight bulge. A seal on the water reclamation tank had a hairline crack. The rubber gasket on my decontamination suit was hardening. Each a tiny flaw, a future failure point. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the imaginary ticks of a million clocks, all counting down to zero. My shelter wasn't a timeless vault. It was a complex machine slowly, inevitably, turning into a relic, just like a lighthouse, just like the bones of Sweetie bleaching in the sun above. I sat at my console, the static hiss of lighthouses beacon in my headphones, a fine sheen of nutrient dust on the keyboard. I was the curator of my own decline, the chronicler of entropy. The struggle had evolved once more. It was no longer about staving off madness or hunger. It was about the sober, meticulous management of decay. How long could I keep the dust at bay? And when the last system failed, would I even hear over the silence? The air changed on day 302. Not in quality. The sensor still glowed a steadfast green, but in feel, it became heavier, thicker to breathe, a psychosomatic response. I told myself, to the relentless psychological pressure. But then the environmental control system logged a 0.5% increase in power draw to maintain the same atmospheric composition. The scrubbers were working harder. I dove into the data, cross-referencing logs. I found a correlation, not with internal systems, but with the outside. The increased load began after a period of heavy, sustained rain visible on the surface cameras. The water table had risen. The geothermal exchange pipes, which also help regulate internal humidity, were likely struggling with the saturated ground. Moisture was the enemy. It bred mold, corroded circuits, promoted rot. My war against dust had a new ally, damp. I adjusted the systems, increasing dehumidification cycles. The power draw ticked up another 0.2%. My battery reserves, while still at 88%, were no longer an abstract number. They were a countdown tied directly to the weather. A long, wet season could drain them faster than projected. I started monitoring surface weather patterns with the intensity of a farmer, which, in a sense, I was. My crop was stability, and the sky was now my unpredictable landlord. Lighthouse's signal began to falter. The clean, digital identifier started to garble, the signal strength dropping precipitously before vanishing for 36 hours. When it returned, it was weaker, corrupted. It felt like watching a friend drown in slow motion. I found myself talking to it, whispering encouragement at the console, as if my will could somehow charge its distant batteries. Hold on, just a little longer. Its struggle mirrored my own, a fight against entropy, against the quiet draining away of power. The external world, in its decay, offered a perverse reflection. With the infected population thinning, other life became bolder. I saw the fox family regularly now. Deer wandered through the facility. Weeds grew over the corpses of Sweetie and Marathoner. Nature was reclaiming the space, indifferent to the tragedy. This should have been comforting, a sign of resilience. Instead, it felt like erasure. The world was moving on, healing in its own way, leaving me behind in my time capsule. I was not a survivor of the apocalypse. I was a fossil from it, already buried. This feeling precipitated experiment sigh. If I was a fossil, I would leave a record, not a digital log that could decay with a power surge, but a physical, permanent one. Using a diamond-tipped engraver from a machine shop, I began to inscribe my story onto titanium alloy wall of the Nexus. I started with the schematics of the shelter, the air and water flow diagrams. Then I moved to text, a condensed version of my log, key scientific observations about the infected, the coordinates and description of Lighthouse. I engraved the periodic table, basic mathematical formulas, diagrams of the solar system. I was creating a modern-day cave painting, a Rosetta Stone for whatever might find this hole in the distant future, human or otherwise. The work was slow, meditative, and deeply satisfying. The screech of the engraver was a violent, beautiful sound that shattered the hum. The act of physically altering my environment, of making a permanent mark, was a rebellion against the dust. I was no longer just maintaining a system. I was adding to it, creating a legacy in metal. One night, deep into an engraving session depicting the life cycle of a star, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my upper molar, a jolt of electric agony that subsided into a deep, throbbing ache. I had a dental emergency. My medical supplies included broad-spectrum antibiotics and painkillers, but no dental tools. The shelter's design had assumed I would be dead from trauma or disease long before a cavity became critical. The pain was a brutal reminder. My body was also a system, and it was failing on its own schedule. The ache became my world. It pulsed in time with my heartbeat, a constant, low-grade torture that made concentration impossible. I doped myself with painkillers, which made me foggy and nauseous. I couldn't eat properly. My meticulously managed caloric intake plummeted. I lay on my cot, watching the status lights blur, the engraved stars on the wall swimming in my vision. In this feverish, pained state, the ghost returned, not as tapping, but as a presence. I felt watched, not from the pipes, but from the corner where the shadows were deepest. I'd turn my head and see nothing but the engraved schematics shimmering in the low light. The line between the physical pain and mental fracturing blurred. Was the ghost real? Was I real? Was the shelter just a dying dream of a man who had fallen on the surface a month ago? Lighthouse's signal gave out. The static on its frequency returned to the bland, empty hiss of dead air. The last other light had winked out. The silence of my headphones was now absolute, a perfect void. I took the headset off and threw it across the room. It clattered against the engraved wall, leaving a scratch on a freshly etched equation. The pressure drop was now internal, a biological system's failure compounding a psychological one. I stared at the dental kit I did have, a pair of needle-nose pliers, and a bottle of high-proof alcohol for sterilization. The solution was obvious, horrifying, and necessary. I couldn't live with this pain. I might not survive the procedure. Infection was a near certainty. I spent a day preparing, sterilizing the pliers in the area, numbing my gum with the last of a topical anesthetic. I positioned a small mirror. My hand shook. This was the ultimate test of my philosophy. I had cut off the world to survive. Now, I had to inflict violence upon my own body to continue surviving within this cage. The procedure was a short, brutal burst of agony that turned the world white. Then, a crushing sense of relief, followed immediately by a coppery tide of blood and the terrifying knowledge of what I had just done. I had become my own surgeon, my own dentist, my own god within this metal womb. The pain was gone, replaced by a raw, wounded throbbing and a deep, systemic shock. I lay back, blood-tinged saliva on my lips, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the machinery sounded different. Kinder, somehow, or perhaps I was just too weak to fight it anymore. I had passed through another membrane. I had crossed a line of bodily autonomy I never knew existed. The shelter had not just protected me from the outside. It had forced me to turn my engineering will inward, onto the failing machinery of my own flesh. I was the system, and I had performed major surgery on myself without shutting down. The pressure had dropped, and I was still here, breathing the heavy, recycled air, more alone than any human had ever been. And I knew with a cold, clear certainty that this would not be the last time. The aftermath of the auto-extraction was a week of fevered haze. I drifted in and out of sleep, plagued by dreams of roots growing through the vents, of my own teeth scattering across the floor like tiny ivory seeds. The infection I feared took hold, a hot, angry swelling in my jaw. I fought it with a brutal course of antibiotics, which left me weak and hollowed out. But I fought and I won. The physical victory, however Pyrrhic, sparked a strange, new clarity. Lighthouse was gone. The ghost was silent, or I had finally stopped listening. The pain was a manageable ache. I had survived myself. The shelter, for all its creeping flaws, had held. I was alive. This bare fact, which had been the entire goal, now felt insufficient. It was a foundation, not the house. Looking at the engraved walls, my history, my science, my screams into the future. I saw their sterility. They were a record of death, of systems, of silence. They were not a record of life. My 5-year countdown of rations was a timeline of consumption, of an ending. I needed a timeline of creation, of a beginning, even if it was only for me. I had the seed bank, dozens of varieties, hermetically sealed in cold storage. I had always viewed them as a future resource, for when I go back up. But going back up was a fairy tale. The future was here, in this 3,000 cubic foot world. So, on day 330, I initiated Project Eden. The challenge was monumental. No natural light, limited space, limited water diverting from the reclamation cycle was a calculated risk. But I had time, artificial light, LED arrays I could repurpose, and nutrient-rich substrate from myself. The closed-loop life support produced a compostable byproduct from process waste. It was the ultimate recycling. I built the garden in the vault, in a disused corner. It was a pathetic, hopeful thing. 3-tiered plastic tubs, illuminated by scavenged LED grow lights on a 16-hour cycle. Their power draw meticulously added to my load calculations. I used the seed bank's most robust, fast-growing varieties. Dwarf peas, sprouting broccoli, a compact tomato variant. I planted them in the treated compost, my hands trembling not with fear, but with a reverence I hadn't felt since before the fall. This was not a practical act. The caloric output would be negligible. It was a spiritual one. I was no longer just a curator of decay or a chronicler of dust. I was a gardener. My purpose was to make something grow. The effect was immediate and profound. The rigid schedule, which had become a prison, now had a joyful focal point. My first check of the day wasn't the status panel. It was the garden. I'd watched the first green breaks in the dark soil with an anticipation that was almost painful. When the first pea shoot emerged, a tiny, curled fist of green, I cried. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen in over a year. I talked to the plants. Not the mad, rambling talk I directed at the lights, but a ghost, but gentle, encouraging talk. There you go. Reach for the light. I calibrated the LEDs, adjusted the drip irrigation, pollinated the tomato flowers with a soft brush. This tiny, controlled ecosystem became the heart of my world. It was life that depended on me, that responded to my care. It was a relationship. The garden of metal and plastic became my clock, my calendar. Its growth stages marked time more meaningfully than any digital readout. Germination, first true leaves, flowering, fruit set. I started a new log dedicated solely to the garden. I drew sketches of the plants. I was no longer just surviving time. I was witnessing a genesis. Of course, problems arose. A fungal gnat infestation brought likely from the compost. I fought it with a diluted hydrogen peroxide mist. A tense battle I won. The tomato plants grew taller than anticipated, threatening to outgrow their light array. I pruned them, heart aching at cutting off healthy growth, but knowing it was for the greater good of the system. Every problem was a puzzle with a solution, a dialogue with life, not a symptom of decay. The outside world, observed through the cameras, continued its slow reclamation. The infected were now rare sightings. Green was everywhere. My garden was a microcosm of that rebirth, a deliberate, loving mirror to the chaotic, indifferent rewilding above. One evening, as I was hand-pollinating the last tomato flower, I heard a new sound from the surface feed audio. Not a moan, a bird song, clear, piercing, and complex. A melody. I stopped, my brush hovering. I hadn't heard a bird sing since the early days. I walked to the console and turned up the gain. There was again a triumphant, territorial song. Life wasn't just reclaiming the space. It was celebrating it. I looked from the screen, filled with golden evening light and the unseen bird, to my own garden, glowing under its purple-tinged LEDs. Two worlds. One vast, free, and oblivious. One tiny, precious, and utterly dependent. I was the bridge between them, the observer, the gardener. The haunting sense of being a fossil vanished. I was not a relic. I was an ark. This shelter wasn't just preserving me. It was preserving a pea seed, a tomato variety, the knowledge of pollination. It was preserving the act of nurturing. I had cut all surface access to keep death out, but in doing so, I had almost sealed life out as well. The garden was my way of prying the door open just a crack and letting it back in. That night, for the first time in months, I didn't dream of roots and vents or tapping pipes. I dreamed of sunlight on green leaves, and the dream was not a memory, but hope grown in a plastic tub under artificial light, 95 feet below the earth. The struggle was no longer against silence or madness. It was to keep this tiny green flame alive. And in that struggle, I found a reason to look forward to tomorrow's digital sunrise. The garden did not save me. That implies a passivity, as if the plants reached out and pulled me from the abyss. No, I saved myself through the garden. It was the tool, the catalyst, the mirror, in tending those fragile green things. I was, for the first time, tending to the part of myself that was not just a system of needs and fears, the part that could create, nurture, and feel wonder. The harvest was meager, 17 pea pods, 3 small, sunless tomatoes, a handful of bitter greens. I ate them with a ceremonial slowness, each bite a sacrament. They tasted like hope and like soil. With the new equilibrium, gardener and engineer in one skin, my perception of the shelter completed its final shift. It was no longer a bunker, a tomb, or a cage. It was a habitat, my habitat. The engraved walls were not just a legacy for future. They were the artwork of my present. The hum of machinery was not an enemy to be drowned out, but the ambient sound of my world's metabolism. I had stopped fighting my environment and had begun to inhabit it. My studies of the surface continued, but the frantic, data-hungry anxiety was gone. It was now simple observation. The infected were gone, whether they had finally decayed into immobility or wandered off. My cameras showed only wind in the grass and the increasing traffic of wildlife. The world was healing in its messy, beautiful way. I found a strange peace in knowing I was not needed up there. My purpose was here. The great challenge became monotony of a different kind. Not the terrifying monotony of emptiness, but the deep, rhythmic monotony of life. Maintenance, gardening, study, exercise. A sustainable loop. The fear of system failure never left, but it lost its sharp, panic-inducing edge. It became just another part of the routine, like checking the soil's pH. I was no longer a prisoner awaiting parole. I was a settler in a strange, small land. On what my clock declared was day 400, I undertook a final, symbolic act. I powered down the main external camera array and the communication receiver. Their constant, silent watch on a world that no longer threatened me felt like an invasion of privacy, theirs and mine. I left one low-power camera active, pointed at the sky, to track daylight and weather. I no longer needed to see the bones of the old world. I needed to see the sky. The silence, when the last fan of the receiver unit spun down, was profound. It was a silence of choice. I had actively chosen to turn my focus inward, to fully embrace my microcosm. The outside world was a fact, like the existence of Antarctica. It was there, but it was not my concern. All that remained was the passage of time, marked now by the life cycles in the plastic tubs. I expanded the garden, dedicating more power and reclaimed water. I began a new strain of potatoes, grown from eyes of my first harvest. I cultivated a culture of sourdough starter from ancient grains in the seed bank. Its slow fermentation, a weekly ritual that filled the nexus with a warm, yeasty smell that overpowered the sterile ozone. My world now had its own seasons, its own harvests, its own smells. I began a new engraving project on the wall opposite the technical schematics. I started carving the patterns of plant leaves, the serrated edge of a tomato leaf, the gentle curl of a pea tendril. I engraved the phases of the moon I remembered, and the constellations as they would appear in the sky I hadn't seen in over a year. I was no longer creating a manual for survival. I was creating a monument to a life being lived. The ultimate test of this new philosophy came on day 458. A primary coolant pump in the geothermal system failed. The alarm was a soft, persistent chime. A year ago, this would have been a crisis that consumed me, a ticking clock toward suffocation or freezing. Now I felt a calm, focused clarity. I reviewed the schematics. I had a spare pump. The repair would be complex, requiring a partial shutdown of climate control for about 6 hours. Temperatures would drop. I prepared. I moved delicate plants to the warmest spot near the core heat exchanger. I suited up. The repair was cold, grueling work in the cramped life support chamber. My breath, fog in the beam of my headlamp. But as I worked, disconnecting lines, swapping out the C's unit, I felt not fear, but competence. I was not fighting the shelter. I was healing it. I was its physician. When the new pump spun to life and the temperature gauges began their slow climb back to 68 degrees, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated pride. I had not just survived a failure. I had integrated it into the narrative of my existence. A story that was no longer about enduring, but about maintaining, improving, and growing. That night, as I sat eating a meal that included my own potatoes and a pinch of my own herbs, I realized I had built a hidden underground shelter not just to survive the zombie outbreak, but to survive the aftermath. The outbreak killed the world. The aftermath, the silence, the isolation, the crushing weight of forever, was what killed the soul. I had built a shelter against that. 2. I had just needed to learn how to turn it from a fortress into a home. I looked around my nexus, at the green glow of the garden LEDs reflecting on the engraved metal leaves, at the soft pulse of status lights that meant equilibrium, at the small, living world I curated. I was not waiting for a rescue or for an end. I was living. The struggle had not ended. It had transformed. It was a gentle, endless struggle of a gardener against entropy, of an engineer against decay, of a man against the quiet. A struggle I could wage day after day for as long as my systems and my will held out. I had cut all surface access. I had sealed myself away from the terror, and in doing so, I had been forced to find a world within. The final unspoken lesson of Project Cicada was this. The most vital shelter you can build is not around your body, but within your mind. And the most resilient life is not the one that hides from death, but the one that finds a reason to grow in the dark. The outside world was dead, or healed, or simply other. It didn't matter. In here, the air was clean, the water was fresh, and something green was reaching for the light. I was a steward of this tiny, silent, breathing world. And for now, and for all the days it could last, that was enough. It was more than enough. I was not a survivor in a hole. I was a man in his home, and I was at peace.